Hello everybody, Chris here, and in this video I want to show you guys 10 things that beginners want to know how to do inside of DaVinci Resolve 15. So first thing is, how do you import media into a project? About as basic as you can get, but very important. So the first one is going to be, how do you import media into a project? So there's two tabs you can do this on. It is the Edit tab and the Media tab. So the Media tab is the one on the leftmost side on the bottom, and then to the right of that is the Edit tab. In DaVinci Resolve, you'll spend most of your time probably on the Edit tab unless you're getting very advanced. But the Media tab is the recommended interface for importing videos into your project. So over on the left in this Media Storage section, you'll notice that there's a bunch of directories added from the computer system. It can also be network locations. And what this section is for is basically just pulling in files from your computer so you can use it in your project. So I think your username / videos is default. So if you have any videos recorded or saved there, so any valid media files in the folder will be represented here. And if there's any preview, you'll be able to see that. I think these are audio only, and that's why you get a black screen there. And of course, you can navigate into subdirectories by clicking on them. You can also expand them in the drop-down menu and see all of the folders that may exist on your computer. But if you want to add in a location where you can pull in your media from, select a folder or a directory from your computer. So for instance, I could add in the desktop here, select folder, and then that directory is going to permanently now pop up on the left-hand section here. So I can click on that and see some videos that I've pulled in from the internet. Notice that when it's a video or an image, you'll see previews in the thumbnail. I can click here and expand the size so that it's more visible. And whenever I find a video that I want to use in this project, I can simply drag it into the media pool down here. So I'm going to bring in this Foggy Mountain clip, and I'll also grab this shot of a coastline and pull that into the project. And I'll also pull in this shot of the cows. So I'm getting some of these free videos from videos.pexels.com. It's a really good source if you're actually looking for free clips that you can use in projects. But now I have these videos inside of the media pool, which means they're going to show up when we go to the Edit tab. So on the Edit tab, you can see in the media pool, it also shows here, I can take these and pull them into my timeline. And the timeline is, of course, where you do most of your video editing. But to show one more way you can add video clips to your DaVinci Resolve project, you can just as easily drag in video clips from your desktop, or if you are using a file explorer, you can go ahead and find a location on your computer where you have video files. And then you simply need to drag in the clips to DaVinci Resolve, just like this. So you could do the same thing from your desktop. And that should give you a few ways that you can bring video clips in. So now once again, to add it to the timeline, you simply need to left click, hold, and drag it into the timeline where you want it. Note that your video clips can go on separate video tracks. If you drag them above the first one, it'll automatically create video track 2 and audio track 2. And you can keep going with video tracks 3 and beyond. And that'll be really useful if you ever do image overlays, or if you want to have something like a picture-in-picture effect where you have a video playing on top of another video. So number 2 is, how do you customize project settings for a DaVinci Resolve project? So the first time you bring a video clip into the timeline, it may give you a little pop-up that will say that the project settings do not match the clip settings. Would you like to change the project settings to automatically match the clip settings? You can just hit the change button there, and then whatever default settings you had in your original video clip, resolution, frames per second, will be updated in the project settings for the video you're working on. But another way that you can change the project settings is to go up to the File menu and go down to Project Settings. So here you're going to have a section called Master Settings, which allows you to change the timeline frame rate, the playback frame rate, the timeline resolution, and other various settings. So timeline resolution is the number of pixels that go horizontal and vertical in your video clip. So 1920 means 1920 pixels horizontally, and then by 1080 pixels vertically. There's also 720p resolution, which is 1280 by 720. And you can go to higher resolutions like 4K, Ultra HD, 3840 by 2160. Normally, you want this to be set to the resolution of your video clips. If you record in a low resolution, you can't magically make your video have a crisper image by bumping up the timeline resolution. So for that reason, recording with a good camera from the start is a good idea. So playback frame rate is going to be basically how many images it shows you back when you're playing it, and then timeline frame rate is going to be how many separate individual frames exist in the timeline that you can edit in. So if you have a timeline frame rate of 25 frames, then that would mean you can set a maximum of 25 keyframes when you're animating on the timeline. Generally speaking, you'll keep these two even. And one thing you're definitely going to be wondering about is, why is this timeline frame rate grayed out? Well, the thing is that once you've already added videos to your timeline, you can no longer change the timeline frame rate. So to change the timeline frame rate, I'd actually need to start a new project and have this set up before I start dropping video clips in. And then if you do get the pop-up that says that your timeline settings are different from your video clip settings, you probably don't want to automatically change that. Because if one of your clips is 25 frames per second, but you want the video to be 30 frames per second, it'll actually drop it down to that 25 frames per second. So simply what I can do if I want that timeline frame rate to change is go to File, New Project, and I'll call it 30 FPS Project. And I'll go up to the File menu, do Project Settings, and I'll make sure this is set to 30 frames per second before we start importing anything. And then when I go back over to the media pool and I drag in this clip, I'm not going to hit change here where it says the clips have a different frame rate. I'm going to hit don't change. And then when I drop this into the timeline, it's not going to change the project settings, and we'll be able to have that timeline frame rate of 30 frames per second. That said, it's generally going to be recommended that your timeline frame rate and your clips match. So if you record one video in 30 frames per second, probably try to record all of them in 30 frames per second as well, so that they consistently match up. So now number 3, we'll talk about the trim tool and the blade tool inside of timeline editing. So in terms of editing on your timeline, the trim tool, which you can click T as a hotkey to access, and the blade tool, which is B on your keyboard, are probably the two tools you're going to be using the most here. So the blade tool, or blade edit mode, will allow you to take a video clip and cut it into 2 pieces. Of course, you can make multiple cuts if you want to separate it into 2, 3, 4, 5 pieces, or however many you want. And with the blade tool selected, you simply go over to the part of your timeline that you want to make the cut, and you'll see this red vertical line. So that's where you would be slicing the clip, and you can just left click to make that cut. So once you have a clip separated into 2 clips, you'll notice that there is now a black border between them, indicating that they are separate clips, and we can move them around using selection mode, A on the keyboard, put them wherever we want in the timeline, delete them as individual clips, so I can hit the delete key there. And you can also apply visual effects to them individually. So for instance, I can left click on this little notch in the top left hand corner and drag that over in order to create a fade in effect. But that will only exist on this clip over here, which is a completely separate entity from the first one over there. So the trim tool, or trim edit mode, is more about cutting around the edges of your clip so that the remaining clip only has the important bits and that you can get rid of some of the extra fluff. So for instance, when you start recording and stop recording, there may be a couple seconds before anything actually happens, and you don't want to show that in the final video. So with the trim tool, you can hover over a clip on your timeline and you'll see various icons depending on where you let the mouse cursor hover. If you click between 2 clips, you can drag the cut between those 2 clips. So basically, if you drag it to the left, that's going to mean that on the right clip, more of that is going to show. So it's basically taking away time from the first clip to add to the second clip. And likewise, you can reverse that, moving this cut to the right, adding in information back to the first clip and pulling away from the second clip. You can also hover over the left or right border and then left click and drag in order to strictly trim from only one of the 2 clips. So I can left click on the border of one clip, not hovering on the middle part between both of them, but rather on the left or the right side. Left click and hold to drag and simply remove information from one clip. You'll notice that any clips that are following it will automatically adjust their position in the timeline so that there's no gap in between them. So I can drag this over here and just remove or trim 1 second off of the first clip. And when you have those random starts and stops in your video, the trim tool becomes really handy because it's great at removing 1 or 2 seconds off the start or end of a clip. You can also hover over the middle section of a clip, left click, hold, and drag to the left and right, Adjusting the starting and ending information of the clip, you notice it can only go as far as you actually have recorded raw footage for. But as long as you have footage to adjust, you can basically change the start and end times without changing the length of the clip that's actually going to show in your timeline. So rather than adjusting the time, you're simply adjusting what gets shown during that time from the original source material. Generally speaking, you will use the blade tool to make big cuts or to separate pieces of your material. And then you'll use the trim tool to clean up around the edges of your video clips that you want in your final project, so that when you export your final product, everything is tighter together and just generally looks better. Okay, so I already showed you how you can add simple fade in and fade out effects by left clicking on the notches of a video clip. So you can do a fade out by clicking on the top right notch in any video clip. And if you do a fade out into a fade in, it's like a fade to black that also fades back in. But there's a lot of other video effects you can actually add in. So if you open up the effects library, and I'm going to reset these fade in effects so that we can show some of this off. In the effects library, you have the toolbox over here with video transitions. This is where you're going to get most of the default effects that you can use in DaVinci Resolve. Also note, it's possible when you have edited those effects to save them as user-defined presets. So before we add in a video transition, I'm going to actually replace one of the clips down here in the timeline so that we actually have something to transition to, because really this has just been random cuts of the same clip. So there's actually nothing to cut to. So if I go to the start of a cut and I left click on the clip I want to replace, then I can simply double click the video in my media pool, click the replace clip button, and that's going to swap out what was there before with this completely new clip. So now we have something to cut to. So we have the beach here and then the mountains over here. So going between the beach and the mountains, a jump cut might work, but we can add in a transition if we want something that looks a little bit smoother. So for instance, we could try something like a blur dissolve effect. If we left click on the video effect in the video transitions of the effects library, we can drag that on the border between two video clips. You can also drag it to the left side and the right side if you want the video transition to be associated with one clip rather than half on one side and half on the other. Usually I'll put them on the border between two. It can look something like this. So you see how we get that blur that transitions into the second shot, and it looks a lot smoother than just suddenly going from one frame to a completely different photo. If you don't like that effect, you can drag any other effect onto it to replace it. So we could try something like an edge wipe and drag that on there. So now we can play it back and see how that looks. So you can see how it's wiping from bottom to top there. So very likely, after you try your first few video transitions, you're actually going to want to edit them a little bit. So when you have a video transition selected, by left-clicking on the transition, it is separate from the video clip. It looks like we have to kind of zoom in here to click on it. So make sure that it's the transition that's selected and has the orange box around it there. We can scroll down in the inspector and see the settings that are available for that clip. So for instance, angle is probably one we definitely want to change here. It's much more interesting if it's at like a 45-degree angle rather than a 0-degree angle. So this will be going from one corner to another corner rather than the bottom to the top. So if we play it back one more time, we get a different effect. So if we add in a border, such as 100 pixels here, we can make this a blurred out feather effect by checking feather, which will take that space which was originally used for the border and make it so that on that border space, it's going to half show the right hand clip and half show the left hand clip. So making it look a little bit nicer than just having a sharp edge here between the two clips. So I do like having that a lot better. And we can replay the clip one more time. So if we try that, and you can see how it looks quite nice with the feather effect and going at an angle rather than just going from bottom to top. So if you want to save any of these video effects, so if you want to save any of these transitions so that you can use them in later projects, right click on them and hit create transition preset. So I could call this CT angled edge wipe, and hit OK. And that's going to add these presets as a user-defined video transition. So we can use this in any other project now. And if you ever want to remove one off the list, just right-click and delete transition preset. So really quickly, when it comes to audio transitions, usually what you're going to use is a crossfade. So you can drag this between two audio clips. Generally, I'll use the 0 decibels one because I don't really want it to affect the audio in the original clip. But if you want it to be louder, do the one with plus dB, and you can also do the one with negative decibels. Note that you can also do fade out and fade in for audio by dragging the white notches in the top left and top right hand corners, just like you can with the video clips. So next up, number 5, how do you create titles in your videos? Well, over in the effects library, there is a section called titles. You'll see some default titles which have existed since DaVinci Resolve 14 and below. These are non-fusion titles, and then everything with the lightning bolt symbol is a fusion title, and yes, that includes Text Plus here. Basically, fusion titles are 3D effects, which are of course more computing intensive to render, but allow you to do things like add in 3D objects, 3D text, shadows, lighting, and all kinds of animation effects. So when we're talking about fusion, we're talking about fusion node setups over here, which can get very complicated. But basically it allows you to combine a bunch of nodes in order to create the video or title effects that you want. So you can add in shapes, you can add in titles, merge them together. It's a bit complicated for the beginner's video, but know that that's generally what's going on whenever you add a fusion title into your video. So if you're new to DaVinci Resolve, I would say stick to some of these base fusion titles and then edit them in the inspector, and then later learn about fusion nodes. So if you want to create something that's really basic, then use either Text or Text Plus. But if you want one that's kind of set up for you, then try out some of these fusion titles that exist down here. So if I drag in 3D title superhero movie into the timeline, I'm going to put it in video track 2 because I want it to show on top of video track 1. And I can scroll through to kind of see its default effect. You can see how, thanks to the settings, that the text is 3D, can spin around in 3D space, has borders, and all that other kind of jazz. Those are things that you can set up in Fusion nodes. But with these pre-generated titles, they give you the ability to customize them simply in the edit mode inspector. So you can see here, we have settings for the top text, we have settings for the bottom text, and the lighting. So this is what the creators of DaVinci Resolve exposed to you in order to customize these titles. So you can go through the settings here. Of course, changing the text is going to be one that you want, of course. So I could say for the top text, the amazing. Note that you can change the font to whatever you want. Plenty of free fonts online if you want to check some of those out. I recommend defont.com, a really good source for free fonts. So if we scroll down further, we can see some of the colors. So face specular color. What color do we want this light to show up on the face? And then further down, the bevel specular color. That's this little edge effect going on there. So we could shift those colors over to something like red. And I'm going to click on this and copy the same HTML code to make sure that pretty much the same color gets applied. And I'll copy that into the bevel specular color. And by doing that, it obviously changes the color of that lighting to red. Maybe we also color shift the bevel itself rather than just the lighting. And we can do the same on the bottom text. I'll change that to red, adjust the bevel color, or actually we'll make the bevel color the same as the top. So I'm going to copy that HTML code in, go down here, change that again, and then we'll make the bottom bevel specular color red as well. So you can see that without really knowing exactly what's going on in the Fusion tab, that you're actually able to customize these settings quite a bit. Also change the movie title here and we'll call it Captain Tutorial. The Amazing Captain Tutorial. Sounds like a great movie. And in the future, if you do want to get into changing the nodes around and really getting complicated in DaVinci Resolve, go over to the Fusion tab, and you can do this for any pre-generated title effect. And you can double click on this group here, to see all of the nodes that are going on in DaVinci Resolve. So you can see when we open up the node group that there's quite a lot of complicated settings that go into things here. You can, of course, click on any individual one and change any settings that you may want to. Just note that that definitely goes beyond the scope of beginner's video editing. And if you want something simpler, you can always just go with a default text title. And you'll see here that when we click on text, there's a bunch of settings that exist, but for the most part, it's just really, really basic. None of the 3D stuff at all. So I could say basic title here, change the font, increase the size, and maybe add offset so that we get a drop shadow here. And then that could be how you just create a really, really simple title there. And of course, you can keyframe that with these diamonds over here on the right. And actually, speaking of keyframes, that's number 6. So let's jump into keyframe animation in DaVinci Resolve. So at a real basic level, when you are keyframing a clip or a title, what you're in effect in doing, you're setting points in time where DaVinci Resolve knows that something should be in a certain place with a certain rotation angle or a certain cropping. And that if you set up any other keyframes, DaVinci Resolve will automatically try to animate between those two keyframes by increasing or decreasing whichever setting has a difference during that period of time. So if at one frame you have it set up that it should have a size of 200, and then at another frame it's 400, it'll go from 200 to 400 over whatever period of time those two keyframes are separated by, and you'll get a computer-generated animation effect. So that is much easier than doing something like frame by frame handcrafted animation, and as a result, it'll save you a lot of time. It's very handy to do keyframing inside of video editor programs. So when you click on any video clip, you will notice a bunch of settings that have these keyframe diamonds next to them. With a basic title or just a regular text title, you can see that they have keyframeable options for position, zoom, rotation angle. For the drop shadow or stroke components, you can also animate the size of a stroke, the offset of a drop shadow. And you can also add in a background section for your little video clip, which looks something like this. So you could animate this to pop in over time. So for instance, wherever I have the timeline cursor set is where the keyframe is going to be created. So I could add in a keyframe here by left-clicking on the gray diamond, turning it into a red diamond, go to a new frame in the timeline, change the setting, and if I make it something like 0.4 there, you'll notice the second keyframe is automatically created. Whenever you change the value of a setting for a clip that already has a keyframe there for that setting, changing the value will create new keyframes automatically. So now if I play back the timeline between those two keyframes, you'll get an animation effect. So you can see it basically expands over time, and then we have the full background come into view. One thing that's nice about this is that you can animate all of these settings individually. They don't even have to be at the same time. So I could go further here into the timeline and create a keyframe for opacity, make that something like 82%. And I can go back to the first keyframe for the height, and there I can set it to be 0% opacity, thus creating another keyframe. And now if I play it back, both settings are going to animate, but one actually completes before the other. And a really great way you can see the timing of all your keyframes is to click on this little bottom right diamond in your video clip or title, and that will expand out where you have your keyframes. You can also click on the curves to get even more information. So when you have this diamond clicked on, it'll show you where your keyframes exist in your video clip. You can also click on the right arrow over here to the right where you see background, and it will show you the individual keyframes. So you can see that height and opacity have a keyframe that starts at the same time, but the second height keyframe ends at about 2 seconds and 15 frames. And then the third one is over here at 3 seconds and 23 frames for opacity. So that's one really good way to keep track of your keyframes. By the way, you can also adjust the timing of your keyframes by left-clicking and dragging those keyframes around if you want to quickly reduce or increase the amount of time that that keyframe animation takes. So let's just do one more for fun over here. With drop shadow, I will create a keyframe for the offset. I'll go to a new location, and maybe I'll drop the offset way down here. So just for fun, let's do one more. I will add in a keyframe for the shadow offset. So that's going to be the location of the shadow offset from the location of the text. I'll go to an earlier location, and I will make it either way below or way above the text itself. And now, if we play it back, it should animate the shadow up there. So it may look kind of silly, but you can kind of get the idea of how animating a bunch of different properties will allow you to create some pretty interesting title animations. And that's even without going into 3D Fusion nodes. So number 7, how do you add in a color LUT or a lookup table inside of DaVinci Resolve so that you can easily color grade your video to give it a certain look? So if you take your video clip and you go over on the 4th tab here, color tab, DaVinci Resolve has a bunch of settings for how you can customize things like the color or the sharpness of your video clip. And there is a box up here on the left called LUTs. So if you click on that, it will open up a bunch of lookup tables that are already defaulted into DaVinci Resolve. You can see here I have some custom ones added, and you can also pull in LUTs from the internet for DaVinci Resolve. If you ever want to add more, just right click and do open file location, and this will open up the folder where all of your LUTs are stored in. So you just need to drag in additional LUTs into this folder. And whenever you want to preview it on your video clip, you simply need to kind of left click on one once and then hover over it to see how it's going to affect the look of your clip. So these color grading effects can be something as dramatic as completely inverting the color to something a little bit more tame, such as just shifting the hue or the saturation of your video clips. So over here in the film looks section, we can experiment with a few here. And you can see how each of these lookup tables gives us quite a different look in terms of our video. So if you find one you like and you want to apply it to the clip, you simply need to double click on it. And what you'll notice over here in the nodes box is that you'll get this little grid that indicates that a lookup table has been applied to the video. And of course, you should also notice it change in the preview window as well. So number 8, on the Fairlight tab of DaVinci Resolve, which is the audio editing tab, how do we add in sound packs to our sound library so that we can search through them and bring them into our video projects? So the sound library can be opened up by clicking sound library in the top left-hand corner. Remember, we're on the Fairlight tab, so that's the one that has the little music note there. And in the sound library, you'll see a search bar, and you can search by name or description. So if I put in punch here, it will search through our sound library and find any clips that basically have the name punch in it or the description punch in it. So you can see I have 0 results here because we haven't added in any directories for the sound library. So if I want to select a sound library, you can click on this button here, which will expand this drop-down menu. You can see that by default, you're looking at the local database, which is just going to be DaVinci Resolve's internal storage for the sound libraries that you have stored on your computer for the most part. And you can also add in PostgreSQL databases, which is more for, I guess, sharing amongst team members. And you can actually add in sound effect libraries to either of those. So if you want to store them in an actual database, you can create a PostgreSQL database. But if you're doing video editing on your own project, then you're probably just going to use local database here. So we want to add in some directories to the local database. So I'm going to click on the 3 dots up here in Sound Library and click Add Library. So now I can add in a folder on my computer, like right here I have documents/sound effects. So these are folders with sound effects that I've manually set up. So you need to basically grab your own sound effects here. But I can select this folder, which will include all subdirectories. So I'll just do that, hit select folder here. And when you do that, it should say added however many clips out of however many sound clips you have. I can now search through my sound library, which is going to contain those folders now. And I can search for certain terms. So if I do sci here, because I know that there's a sci-fi project, you can see that some of these sound effects pop up. It will show the duration of that effect, the audio waveforms of that sound. You can also give them a star rating if you want to basically label which ones are good and which ones are bad. And then hit play in order to test the sound effect before you add it to your video timeline. So let's go ahead and play back this sound effect. And then if we decide we like the sound effect, then we can drag it into the audio timeline over here. So you can see here, if I drag it below audio track 1, audio track 2 gets created automatically. And we can just drag the sound effect straight into there. So now we've pulled in sound effects that exist in our sound library straight within DaVinci Resolve. Of course, using a sound library like this is probably more useful when you have thousands of sound effects and you're using a database that's shared among team members. But if you're simply using sound effects that exist on your computer, so if I wanted to add in a sound clip here, I can use Windows File Explorer, drag the sound clip in directly by dragging it and dropping it into DaVinci Resolve just like that. So either way works. It's kind of up to you what you prefer, if you like mixing in Windows File Explorer or if you want all your clips to be in the media pool or the sound library. But that's how you would use the sound library if you choose. So number 9, how do you record a audio voiceover? So in the Fairlight tab, you'll notice over here that there's a mixer, and you can see the mixer has a section for input, a section for effects, which allows you to add in VST plugins such as Reaper plugins or some of the Fairlight effects that are default inside of DaVinci Resolve in order to customize the sounds that come in from those inputs. So basically, you could add something like a noise filter right on top of your microphone in DaVinci Resolve while you're recording, or you can record first and then add those effects on afterwards. So with the input, we want to click on that, go to Input, and you can select microphones on your computer. So for instance, I have 3 USB audio devices here, and I can patch that to specific audio channels. So considering that the video already has its own audio, I probably would want to record this on audio track 2. You can always add in a new audio track to add it onto by doing right click, add track, stereo. And then we can reopen that. So left click input, and now you see that audio track 3 becomes an option. So I can patch these together by selecting the microphone on the left and the output destinations on the right, patch them, and now the microphone is going to be feeding into audio 3 left channel and audio 3 right channel. Okay, so we can't see that third audio track there because we have to expand the mixer a bit, so that reveals audio track 3. You can see that the microphone is now set up there. In order to record the voiceover though, what you need to do is queue up the audio track for recording. So you do that by finding the audio track where you have the microphone and hitting the R button there. So when I do that, you can see that the audio is now inputting into audio track 3, but this isn't actually writing to the timeline until we hit the record button on the timeline. So as long as we're getting audio track input and we hit record, it's going to be taking whatever sounds are going in there and it's going to be writing it straight to the timeline as a new audio file. So if I hit record here, you will see that it is recording audio. The audio waveforms show up immediately, and this is basically like a voiceover narration that you can decide to use or decide to not use for your video clip. So number 10, how do you export a video in DaVinci Resolve? So as you might have guessed, the Deliver tab or the Exporting tab is the last one over here because that's usually what you do when you're done with the video. So if you go over to the Deliver tab, you'll see all of the settings for how to do a video export. Generally, when you render, you're going to want to have entire timeline selected, but if you want to only export part of your timeline, make sure you hit I on the keyboard to set an in point, O to set an out point, and then instead of rendering the entire timeline, it'll now render in an out range. You can, of course, change that back to entire timeline if you want to render the entire video, usually what you want. So then in the render settings over here on the top left-hand corner, you will have custom settings for YouTube, Vimeo, other things, other projects. Generally, you can use H.264 master, YouTube 1080p. The two best formats I found to export from DaVinci Resolve are either a QuickTime.mov or as a MP4. So you can see here, export video format. QuickTime is going to associate with a .mov file, and MP4 is obviously a .mp4. So using the MP4 with .h.264 video codec is perfectly good. So generally, it's not going to make too much difference, but you're going to want to either choose QuickTime with H.264 or MP4 with H.264 video codec. Aside from that, you scroll down, your frame rate generally isn't going to be editable once you've already gone this far in your video editing, since that's kind of locked in place once you start adding videos to your timeline, but your output resolution can be customized. So you may want that in the full video resolution, or you can shrink that down to a lower resolution if file size is an issue for some reason. Generally, you can leave that alone. So quality, you can restrict to either a specific bit rate, defaulting to 10,000 kilobits per second, which is plenty for most videos. You can also do automatic quality. Once again, if for some reason you need lower file size, you can drop that down. Sometimes when I'm doing screencast videos, I'll take the kilobits and make it restrict to 5,000. Generally, it won't really make too much difference. So in most cases, you can just leave it at 10,000 and that should be fine. And you can also just click on YouTube. In DaVinci Resolve, they default the format as .mov with the QuickTime format, but MP4 is good as well. So once you've customized those video settings, you can probably go straight to file. There's not too much in the way of audio to really mess with generally. So in the file tab over here, you're going to want to give it a custom name. So this will be the file name where you're saving it to the computer. What is it going to be called? So in this case, I could call it the 10 things beginners want to know how to do in Resolve 15. Kind of a long title, but okay. And if your settings are good, then you can hit add to render queue, which is going to pop it over here in the job one. So you'll notice it's named the name of the project and the timeline that you're exporting. You can have multiple timelines in one video project. And when you render it, it'll actually have this custom save name. So you want to render the project. Note that the reason that they have a render queue is if you want to export multiple videos at one time, basically leave your computer running for a while and get multiple files exported, you can queue up a bunch of jobs here, select them all, and then go to start render. But here we only have one job, so I'm just going to hit start render here, and it's going to start exporting the video that we created. So that's the basics of how you export a video in DaVinci Resolve. And that's it for my top 10 things beginners want to learn how to do inside of DaVinci Resolve. So I hope that you found some stuff that was useful in this video and you understand DaVinci Resolve a little bit better. So I've been Chris, thanks for watching, and I will see you guys in my future video content.